Okay, so I'm recording. Hi, Aikaterini.
Hello.
I'm David Kazanjian. I'm talking to you from my apartment in Brooklyn, New York, where I live and have been for months and months, like many of us in our own spaces. I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, where I teach in English and comparative literature. And why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Aikaterini, and I'm joining David in my first Zoom experience, which is, well, not common, not to be in Zoom so much. And I am an artist. I am in Greece during the lockdown. Normally I live in the UK, but I've been spending time in a lot of different places the last couple of years. One place was the US, and I work with found images, still and moving, and I wouldn't call myself a photographer, but my practice is an expanded photographic collage practice.
Excellent, great. Well, today we wanted to talk about your new artist book, Handbook of the Spontaneous Other. And so I wanted to ask you some questions, have a conversation about this book, which really fascinates me. As you know, all of your work fascinates me, and I've been writing about your work for a while now. So this is a chance to really start thinking about this new project of yours, which I was lucky enough also to be around when you were starting. So that's a nice connection to bring this project full circle. So maybe you could say a little bit about, just introduce the book to people who are watching this, describe it, and say a little bit about how it came about.
Yes, so the Handbook of the Spontaneous Other is my second collage/artist book, collage photo book. It is the first one that I am publishing with MACK. My first photo book, which you know very well, A Small Guide to the Invisible Seas, was produced as part of the work that I made for the Armenian Pavilion in the 56, I think, Venice Biennial. And that was my first photo book, and also it started my fascination with the form. I think as I am working more and more, I'm liking more making books than exhibitions, and I say that before. And they are like surprised. And Handbook seems, on the surface, completely different to A Small Guide to the Invisible Seas, because of the type of material that it is collaging. So in the Small Guide to the Invisible Seas, I focused on tourist catalogues of Soviet Armenia, Greece, and Turkey from the 60s to the 70s. So it has a very specific historical, geographical, political, ideological framework. In the Handbook of the Spontaneous Other, seemingly I moved completely different terrain, and the material that I am using are all images, lifestyle images or images of popular culture produced in the West, mainly the US. And the premise of the book is that somehow it's a handbook, an alternative handbook of how to find the spontaneous other. I was inspired by material that I actually found in New York when we first started working together in 2014. And I was going to this, I don't think it exists anymore, this flea market in Hell's Kitchen. And of course, I was fascinated by the abundance of vintage 50s, 60s, even 40s lifestyle magazines and Life and Time and all this. And there were two things that kind of, well, one thing caught my attention and the other was accidental. So I wanted to buy this one photographic pornographic magazine, which was the first time I was going to buy something like that in the flea market. And I was hesitating. In the end, I bought it. I was drawn to it because it was black and white. And I was thinking and thinking and thinking why I was drawn to this one. And I think it is the reason that it is black and white and feels more like artistic rather than pornographic, if we can say that. And then the guy, I think he knew me by then, he gave me for free, and this I insist, this is not a makeup. He gave it for me for free. This book. He said, "Take this book. Me and my wife have used it. You can use it now." So it has a blue cover. I think I have it here. Maybe I should bring it.
Yeah, that's it.
We have to make a pause for me to bring it up. It is a manual of how to become a gigolo, and this. Manual of how to become a gigolo became the kind of starting point for the handbook, because I started thinking, how can I, in the beginning, the idea was, how can I make a manual about female sexuality, because the book was about actually addressing female pleasure, and then I realized that this is all quite constructing gender positions. This reimagined masculinity is not really emancipatory, it's still a form of labor. So from the whole process, what I ended up with is first a very specific type of material, which is this Western produced images of lifestyle, from interior to exploration of nature, from the bodies of athletes, dancers, porn, sexual workers, to plants and gardens. So very specific photographic public sphere, if you can describe this, a public sphere which produces a hegemonic cultural identity of the Western, I suppose, and the form of the manual, this instructional format as a kind of way of organizing knowledge. Okay, I brought it.
Great. So there's the gigolo handbook.
From the outside, you cannot really understand much, because it is like that. And then, providing special services to women. So the title was very enticing.
When was this published? Do you know? Does it say when it was first published?
No, because it says first 1994. It's a self-published. It's self-published.
So what you did was you were finding, you were in New York and you were finding these, at the flea market, these magazines and handbooks and self-help to-do guides from the maybe 1960s, 1970s, 1980s into the 90s that were, at first glance, very different from one another. There you had porn, you had lifestyle magazines, you had sports magazines, you had this handbook of how to be a gigolo. So, at first glance, they seem totally different. They're different genres, they're for different purposes, but they were linked, and they are linked in some really interesting ways that you've made visible in your handbook of the spontaneous other and your repurposing of those images. So how are they linked? Like what links these very different very different sources? I mean, elsewhere you've talked a bit about how they reproduce a kind of gaze that they seem to share from your perspective, and also that they play a certain role in producing an idea of the self, the individual that you wanted to challenge.
Yes. I go back again to a small guide because it is so different. So people that know my practice will be surprised, or when they open this book. I call this my Western moment. It came together with another work that I've been researching and I haven't finished yet, which I've been doing in the Library of Congress in DC. I've been researching American post-war newsreels. And I think I mentioned this because it is important, because I had collected this material, but for me, up until then, were examples of popular culture, which I hadn't realized that they are linked. The research that I was doing in the Library of Congress and watching all these American news series from post-war, from 1945 to 1957, I realized that crystallized in my head that at that moment, America produced a hegemonic cultural identity. And this hegemonic cultural identity, it might be, I call it lifestyle. Academically, we can kind of work through different type of interpretations and configurations. So for me, this is a type lifestyle which was then exported as a kind of way of being in a kind of consumer-driven capitalist neoliberal economies, is a form for me of cultural identity. So what I realized as I started making this first impetus was the kind of sexual description or sexual consideration of expression of female sexuality or sexuality in general, was that they are produced by an imperialist, hegemonic, patriarchal gaze, mainly, even if we find examples where they are not. The mass of the images were produced through this American imperial hegemonic patriarchal gaze. So this is what unifies them, and this is what, again, I already mentioned, creates a specific public sphere. So these material have shaped a specific cultural identity, and suppose then a collective imagination and collective memory. And that's why I'm interested in them, and not so much because they are vintage nostalgic images. I'm interested in them as contextual documents of a specific formation of specific identity.
Yeah. So in part, also, it seems like this gaze, the original source material you're using, aims to produce, to teach people how to be better gigolos, or how to be better athletes, or how to be better dancers, or how to be better surfers, or how to be better hikers, just to use some of the examples of some of the sources you use. That is, they were self-help texts trying to improve individuals' bodies, performances, selves, right? So you wanted to kind of mess with that, the presumptions behind it, and
yes.
That really interests me. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, like what we would say, like the meliorist imperative of these source texts, the imperative that they have to get better and better and improve our individual selves.
So when I realized that there is a kind of a specific cultural identity and imagination that I am starting to reread, I start thinking, which is a cultural hegemonic, let's say Western, I wouldn't call it just American, Western identity. I start thinking of also the experience of living in 2014 and 2018 in the US. It was important in understanding in the contemporary moment how these images had shaped certain ways of being. I start noticing the importance of pop psychology in the way that in the American society relations are organized or explained. So there seems to be a kind of textbook of how you will behave in its given situation. And then I started also start looking at other people's reading, like Adam Curtis in his seminal documentary. I think there are 6 or 4 episodes from, I think, 1990 something.
This is the Century of the Self documentary.
He also described, which for me is a very important way of thinking, described how the movements of resistance, the student movements of the 60s in America, turned inwards into this self-discovery and self-expression, which became the motor for creating a new type of consumer narrative in the US, which is based on this lifestyle, and the lifestyle is based in the idea that you are somehow expressing yourself, and so through your choices of consumer goods, you're also expressing yourself. So all these type of realizations made me think that everything that the magazine, this culture of lifestyle self-expression that the imagination of these magazines produce is a form of labor. And in order to express yourself within capitalist, neoliberal societies, somehow you still have to work. It's not free. It's not really expressing. You are placed, your body and I suppose your emotions are placed within conditions of labor, because in order to be healthier, better, sexier, enjoy yourself, find yourself, you need to work. So I start thinking of this type of assimilation of capitalist processes, of how the body is always placed, even in the narratives of resistance. So even if we go back to the narratives of this self-expression of the 70s, okay, you will be able to escape capitalist alienation if you are liberated sexually, or the body somehow becomes the locus of liberation. So in these narratives, again, for me, capitalism comes and turns it into a lifestyle or a type of aesthetic imagination where you are continuously working. So I was trying to imagine a handbook that somehow takes these images of this public sphere, this type of collective imagination of extreme emotional labor, and turn it into something that does not require for the viewer to do any work, first of all. So that was the kind of thing. I wanted to make something where you're not forced to either consume or work, and also it doesn't give you any instructions.
Yeah, so it's like the fiction of the original source material is all of this will help you realize whoever you want to be, but the actual work that it does is to demand that we generate normative bodies, bodies that conform to certain expectations and norms, able bodies, white bodies, consumerist bodies, etc. And so by tearing these images out of their original sources and repurposing them in your book as collages, it seems clear to me that you tear apart that kind of normative impulse of the gaze that you just described, and then transform them into what? Okay, so if your handbook is a handbook of the spontaneous other, it's presumably not a handbook like the handbooks you've torn the images out of, although maybe it shares something with those handbooks too. How is your how-to different in the handbook of the spontaneous other than the how-to of the books that you've torn the images from?
There's no how-to. It is a kind of a narrative. It's based on color. So the narrative of the book and the narrative, the linkage, the continuation comes through a kind of color shift from white. It starts with white, which the images in white are very normative, the collages in white. And then it progresses through a series of colors. There are 9 chapters, let's say, but there is no title in the chapters. There are just The chapter starts with this kind of circle, because the whole book has a kind of circular quality. Again, similar to a small guide, which was also a type of circular narrative. And then you have this kind of color gradation, color change as a way to create narrative, which I mean to establish the passing of time. I was thinking while I was doing that it is like also, of course, it's like the rainbow, but it's also like the sun casting its light into one image, and then suddenly the whole book is this kind of change of the color of this first image into this variation. So the book also, you can say that it is a variation, this first image, which is the image of, I call it the petrified image of a heterosexual romantic love. And the whole book in this narrative of continuous gradation and change provides all possibilities of encounters between bodies that this petrified image does not allow. And all these encounters of petrified bodies, of not petrified bodies, of all possibilities of bodies coming together in spaces, is revealed because the light changes, because the color of the landscape changes, because the sun moves, because time is passing. And and this is also for me a formal formal association with photography, because we are talking about the light passing through the keyhole. There is this kind of relationship. So in the sense, the book, although it is a collage book, it's also a photographic book. It looks at how the social, it is about photography, about the medium as a kind of, and its function in the social sphere. And the handbook, in terms of not giving you instructions, it tries to give rise to many voices in these encounters between different bodies. So you have first this idea of the spontaneous other, this figure, who somehow, as I suppose you are looking for it as you are going through the book. And then in the end, there is a text which uses the collective we. It's a text prose poem. You can describe it as, I didn't write as a poem, but it has this kind of, I suppose, prose poem form. And in that, also this I realized afterwards, in that moment, in that text, the we is the image is speaking. So between this spontaneous other that you're trying to find, that the image is speaking, somehow the discovery of something else happens. I'm not sure if this something else is the spontaneous other.
Yes, okay, I can really see that. I'm
not sure if I answered your question.
I think you did. So we're kind of edging toward the question of like who and what the spontaneous other is, what's spontaneous about this otherness, and what's other about the perspective that you're offering. So I'm interested in all of that, and hearing you talk about all of that. It seems like from my time with your handbook, it seems like you wanted to challenge the imperative that the source material images proffer to, in their original context, to work that we should all work to become better, stronger, hotter, sexier, and you wanted to kind of flip the script on that imperative, and to ask questions about who is being asked to conform to this regime of labor of becoming better and better, and to interrupt it and to replace it, to displace it.
The first kind of reversal, I suppose, is that in this handbook, in order to find this kind of, some kind of elevated state, you have to become the other. So the material that I'm using, which were produced in order to construct the hegemonic cultural identity, which in itself was oppressive because it puts you in conditions of labor, continuous labor, are used in the sense they are liberated, and they are used in order to give voice to voices that were not there. So they're used as ways of describing this spontaneous other, but also in order to become better, somehow you have to become the thing that you are continuously excluding. As today, I think I was going through my notes, and I realized that this spontaneous, it is also spontaneous because in kind of decolonizing or post-colonial discourses, the other is always fixed by the hegemonic ideology. So because I didn't want to fix anything, that's why it is spontaneous, because in that way it is not the other that you're fixing, because it always appeared by accident. And I always thought that I wanted to subvert this, using the image of the West, produce something that it's also always excluding. So what is also the spontaneous other, I thought, is the one that is not produced by the West in the end, is some type of ways of being that are not produced by the discourse of the West. And that's why you do not have, you don't have instructions, and you don't follow the certain type of grammar and logic and syntax that comes from Western traditions.
Nice. Yes. So, I mean, in that sense, I think the book really connects with a tradition, a varied and diverse tradition of theories of otherness in Western philosophy, which are each quite different from each other, whether we're talking about Lacan and the psychoanalytic tradition of thinking about otherness, whether we're talking about Levinas and the philosophical tradition that he represents of thinking about otherness, whether we're talking about critical race theory and ethnic studies, especially in the US, and its tradition of seeing normative regimes of othering, or we're talking about even Sartre and his understanding of projection and otherness in a book like Anti-Semite and Jew. All of those very diverse theories, which are different from one another, ask us to think about, in one way or another, how selfness, the self, is consolidated. And you too are very interested in how a kind of regime of selfness is consolidated during this period in these popular cultural genres of handbooks and how-to guides. And like, I've always been fascinated how your practice of tearing images out and recomposing them, how that practice is really like a tearing apart of hegemonic regimes or normative regimes, ripping them apart, really, quite literally. But then the harder part is in some ways the recomposing. And so that's why I think we started talking about the spontaneous other, who and how this otherness that you're seeking to recompose over and against the normative regimes of otherness that you're tearing apart, is or could be spontaneous. Do you want to say more about that, or what's the spontaneity in the otherness that you're trying to recompose? What does that represent? You started earlier by saying, well, it's a refusal to work on some level.
Yes. I haven't really talked about this or thought about this spontaneity. I suppose it is the other. I was thinking in a very, very simple terms that it is the other that is continuously being present and appearing and disappearing. So that's why it is spontaneous, because you cannot fix it. The moment you fix it, then you go into the kind of hegemonic structures. You are going into binary or hierarchical positions. So I didn't want to create. I am trying in my practice in general, to find ways of creating images, narratives, combinations where I try not to follow hegemonic traditions of organizing thought. So the spontaneous other, in a very simple term, is the one that is always this kind of elusive. You are never ever able to kind of fix. That's why I told you this first image. The whole book might be a variation of the first image, because you're becoming continuously, spontaneously, continuously other again and again and again as you move through the book. So is this kind of multiplicity of the viewpoint. The spontaneous, I think I haven't articulated clearly yet, so I'll try now. I think somehow it's also linked with a way to try to conceptualize or to describe thinking. So in terms of, in the way that I'm trying to accept these images as thinking mechanisms or thinking deposits, not only as ideologically constructed surfaces. If the images have this possibility to produce thought, then somehow they have also their ability to be spontaneous. And if images are also able to provide pleasure, which is an important part of the book, that images, they are not only this kind of evil structures that codify us, they're also sources of pleasure. And if pleasure can be had in images, and images can also be thoughts, then there is a way of producing pleasure that is not, it is a form of thinking.
Yeah, there's deep politics to that. There's deep politics to that project that I'm interested in pulling out from this incredible book. It recalls to me a certain kind of tradition of I guess what we used to call spontanism, a kind of Rosa Luxemburgian tradition over and against a kind of Leninist tradition on the communist left, for instance, which I know you have some connection to. So I wonder if you see a connection to a kind of spontaneous politics, even if it's an aesthetic connection.
I'm not familiar. You have to explain it to me.
Well, and the reason I'm bringing it up is because I think a kind of spontaneous politics animates some of the current anarchistic social movements that are really enlivening the world right now, which is to say, a politics that allows for improvisation, allows for social movements to cohere and congeal without pre-planned platforms or programs. That kind of politics over and against an older, more traditional, let's say on the left, Leninist or vanguardist politics that demands a certain conformity and demands a certain pre-programmed plan. It seems like the handbook, to the extent that it's a political enterprise, is on the side of a kind of spontanism.
Yes, I did not, yeah, I did not think of this, but yes, I need now to research it, because I was not, I suppose the radical, if we are looking for where the radical politics comes, even if I am not conversed in the spontaneous rules Republican like tradition, is that you do not have to work to become better. You have to think to become better. Or the radical potential of art or photography, of the image, is the fact that it can create forms of thought. It can create radical consciousness. So in that sense, yes, this is the kind of political aspect of the book, which I'm very conscious in this particular work that I am not disguising it. I am subverting it. I am using the material in a overly sensualized way. So I want to seduce you, as well as talk about ways of thinking that can challenge hegemonic behaviors.
Right. That to me, that I can see that in a lot of your work, and particularly in this handbook. It's something that maybe we in literary studies might call poiesis, which is an ancient Greek word that probably has some contemporary Greek equivalent that you know well. But the ancient Greek word of poiesis is referred to a kind of imaginative remaking, remaking of the world through imagination. So not just thinking or hoping for a better future or something like that, but an actually remaking of the now in the present via and through a kind of radical imagination. The other day
I was always,
yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I was linking from earlier on in my thinking. I was really linking this poiesis, which is poiesis, which is the poetry in modern Greek. But it's not this, obviously, in the ancient usage. I was linking, for me, it's a process of production. So for me, it's very Marxist. I was always linking it to thinking that everything is always produced. Things do not just appear. There are relations of production that shape our relation in the world in general. So for me, poetics, also in terms of images, are the mechanisms of their production.
Yes, great. That's why I feel like it has so much, in a way that might not be obvious at first glance, so much connection to our current kind of moment of kind of a kind of radical flourishing of political thought around the globe in so many different ways. The other day I was watching Fred Moten, who's a Black poet and political theorist here in the US, talk about how the figure of the imagination has been so problematic in so many ways throughout the history of Western thought. He was talking in particular about how Kant, in the Critique of Judgment, talks about how we need the imagination, but the imagination needs to be controlled, contained, policed really by the understanding. And there's a long tradition of kind of trying to harness and control the imagination in order to subject it to kind of normative regimes of thought. And it seems to me that your Handbook of the Spontaneous Other is an active poiesis to the extent that it's challenging that kind of control, containment, disciplining of the imagination in the name of normative regimes of thought. That's what I felt in looking at it, reading it at this particular historical moment. And that's where it seemed to have a kind of really fecund politics to me.
Great. Thank you.
Just as a kind of putting a kind of capstone on that conversation we're having about the politics of the project, the very last line of the poem that concludes the handbook is "We are the other uprising." So
yeah,
really,
yes, because there are certain things that I also point in the text to certain types of politics of resistance, which I am resisting. So it's like a total resistance towards everything. This is the spontaneous other is not a universal, because we're self-expressing, all of us self-expressing, we're not universal. And is also we are not self-expressing. And it starts in the text, it starts with the fact that this only the kind of movement of trying to find the spontaneous other or trying to speak is a threat. And the threat is what becomes the uprising. And this is a kind of continuous circle in the book, as is the light changing. So I'm not sure if this, I think the fact that it ends with "we are the other uprising" is a kind of hopeful, positive.
Yeah, we certainly all need an other uprising. We may be in the midst of an other uprising, which itself is an inheritor of many other uprisings over many years. And I find that hopeful too.
The positive legacy. So the spontaneous other could also be conceptualized as the one that takes the position of being in a continuous uprising.
Yes.
It is not, again, this uprising that comes now in this moment, especially as you're experiencing it in the US. It is not a momentarily thing, and I suppose this is also quite Marxist way of thinking. We are in continuous uprising.
That's perfect. Well, I think that's a great place to stop. Thank you so much for talking with me and talking with everyone about this project of yours.
And yes, and I should say that Handbook of the Spontaneous Other, we are doing this as part of MACK Live, because the book was published the moment where everything went into lockdown. I still have not seen it in the bookshops, so I'm hoping I really would like, because I like books, I hope to see it in the bookshop. So we were supposed to launch it together in New York, but this hasn't happened. So this is part of MACK Live now and our digital lives.
Yeah, which live on. Our lives live on, hopefully a bit more spontaneously than they have been over these last few months.